father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. Hate your family? This isn't a misinterpretation or a one-off verse. This is a pattern in Jesus' teachings. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus repeatedly demanded absolute loyalty, even if it meant severing ties with family. Step 1, isolate people from their families. Step 2, convince them that their real family is the group. And then step 3, demand complete obedience and devotion. This isn't unique to Jesus. This is the foundation of cult psychology. We've seen this before. Jim Jones discouraged followers from maintaining ties with outsiders. David Koresh taught that loyalty to the group was more important than personal relationships. Charles Manson demanded that his followers see him as their new father. It seems they were all answering the question, what would Jesus do? Jesus' message wasn't about strengthening family bonds, it was about replacing them with loyalty to him. If a religious leader today said these exact words, we would immediately recognize them as controlling and dangerous. So why does Jesus get a pass? This isn't just about a single verse. This is about how Jesus framed devotion, not as a personal journey, but as an all-consuming requirement that placed him above every human connection. And if a belief system demands that you sever ties with loved ones to prove your loyalty, is it really about love or control? Follow me and get rich. This one we're going to be pulling from Matthew chapter 19, Mark chapter 10, and Luke chapter 18. Christians often say that faith requires sacrifice, that following Jesus means giving up worldly possessions for a greater spiritual reward. But what they don't emphasize is what Jesus actually promised in return. He said everyone who's left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or fields for my sake will receive 100 times in this season and will inherit eternal life. Let's break this down. Step 1, abandon your family. Step 2, give up your home, land, and possessions. Step 3, follow Jesus. And step 4, be promised 100-fold return in this lifetime and eternal life. This is not just a call to self-sacrifice, this is a transaction. Jesus wasn't asking people to follow him because it was the right thing to do. He was offering a financial and eternal reward. This is the exact framework of prosperity gospel theology today. Sow a seed and you'll be blessed 100-fold. Give up everything and God will reward you. Trust the process and riches will come in due time. It's not a coincidence that modern televangelists and megachurch pastors use the same formula because they're following the exact model Jesus laid out. This isn't a call to faith, it's a recruitment pitch. Imagine any leader today telling followers to give up their livelihoods in exchange for wealth and eternal status. We'd recognize it immediately as a financial cult. So why do we pretend Jesus wasn't doing the same thing? This wasn't just about devotion, it was about leveraging obedience for promised rewards. And if a religious movement requires absolute loyalty, personal sacrifice, and the hope of future wealth, is it faith or is it business? Let the dead bury their own dead. Matthew chapter 8 and Luke chapter 9. Losing a loved one is one of the most painful experiences a person can go through. Funerals aren't just about saying goodbye, they're about grieving, honoring, and finding closure. So imagine this. A man approaches Jesus and says, Lord, I want to follow you, but first, let me go bury my father. Jesus' response? Let the dead bury their own dead. No compassion, no acknowledgement of grief, just a cold dismissal. What kind of leader tells people to abandon their grieving families? This isn't just an isolated moment. It fits right in line with how Jesus treated loyalty. He told people to hate their families. He promised rewards for those who left their homes and loved ones. Now he's telling someone that mourning isn't as important as following him. This is the exact type of demand that high control groups make. Cults discourage personal attachments. They insist that true believers put the group first. They reframe grief and personal obligations as distractions from the mission. If a religious leader today told someone to skip their own father's funeral to prove their devotion, we'd call it out immediately. So again, why does Jesus get a pass? This isn't just a tough teaching. This is a red flag. Any belief system that demands people abandon personal grief, sever family ties, or ignore natural human emotions isn't about love, it's about control. Outsiders are dogs. Matthew chapter 15 and Mark chapter 7. Christians love to say that Jesus was all about love and inclusion. that he welcomed everybody with open arms. But when we actually read the Gospels, we see a different picture. A Canaanite woman, a desperate mother, approaches Jesus, begging him to heal her sick daughter. What response does Jesus give? It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Not lost souls, not unbelievers, dogs. He dehumanized her. This is the language of supremacy. Throughout history, when groups have wanted to justify oppression, they start by reducing people to animals. Racists called black people subhuman to justify slavery. Nazis called Jewish people rats to justify genocide. Colonizers called indigenous people savages to justify their destruction. Jesus was speaking directly in this tradition, placing his own people above outsiders. And before Christians say, oh, but he healed her daughter in the end, let's be clear. He ignored her at first. When his disciples tried to send her away, he agreed with them. And when she refused to leave, he insulted her. Only after she accepted her place beneath him did he grant her request. This is not kindness. This is humiliation. Imagine a doctor refusing to treat you unless you accept that you're inferior. That's not love. That's power dynamics. If any religious leader today spoke like this, they would be rightly condemned. So why do we pretend Jesus wasn't doing the same thing? I came to bring division, not peace. This is from Luke chapter 12. Christians call Jesus the Prince of Peace. They say he came to unite people, spread love, and bring harmony to the world. But according to Jesus himself, he said, do you think I came to bring peace on earth? No, I tell you, but division. That's not a misinterpretation. He explicitly stated that his presence would divide families. From now on, there will be 5 in one family divided against each other, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son and son against father, mother against daughter and daughter against mother. That is not a message of peace. That's a message of separation. Let's put this in context. What do high control religious groups do? They pit families against each other. They demand total loyalty to the belief system. They frame non-believers as enemies. This is cult rhetoric. Jesus wasn't uniting people. He was creating an in-group and an out-group, and he was doing it on purpose. And history proves that his message didn't bring peace. It brought centuries of religious wars, Christian-on-Christian violence, over 44,000 Christian denominations, each divided over doctrine, and countless lives that have been lost to the sword and the cross. If Jesus came to bring unity, why is Christianity one of the most divided religions in history? The truth is, Jesus' words planted the seeds for division, and we're still living with the consequences. Look, if this conversation about Jesus has you thinking, you need to read my book, Christ Held Up. I break down the myths, the contradictions, and the real reasons Christianity just might have it completely wrong. It's available right now on Amazon and Windows Shop, and if you're a patron at certain levels, you get it for free. Plus, patrons get early access to exclusive content, including my upcoming video on how to stop Christian nationalism. So if you want to keep diving deeper into these types of conversations, grab the book, join the Patreon, and get a front row seat to everything I'm building behind the scenes. If you don't believe in me, you're condemned. This is Mark 16. Christians say that Jesus is love, that he came to save the world, not judge it. But when we look at his actual words, he says, whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. Let's sit with that for a second. You're born into the world. You might be kind, moral, and compassionate. You might never have even heard of Jesus, but if you don't believe in him, you're condemned. That's not love, that's spiritual extortion. Think about it. If someone threatens you with harm unless you pledge loyalty to them, we recognize that as abuse. If a leader demands worship under threat of punishment, we call that authoritarianism. If any religious figure today preached this exact doctrine, we wouldn't hesitate to call it manipulative. Or at least I hope we wouldn't. So why does Jesus get a pass? This isn't a universal message of love. It's a demand for absolute obedience, and history proves it. This doctrine has been used for centuries to justify forced conversions. It has fueled religious wars and persecution. It has instilled generations with fear of questioning their faith, because when belief is forced through fear, it's no longer faith, it's control. Fear God who can destroy you in hell. Matthew chapter 10. Christians say God is love, that he wants a relationship with us, not a fear-driven obedience. But then Jesus says this, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Let's break this down. Jesus is saying, don't fear earthly threats. Fear the one who can send you to eternal torment. That one is God. This, again, isn't love. This is intimidation. This is a threat. It's like that song, if you think you're lonely now, wait until tonight, beloved. This is not romantic. This is a threat. This is the exact same tactic used in abusive relationships. I love you, but if you don't obey me, there will be consequences. I'm doing this because I care about you. You should be grateful I'm even giving you a chance. This isn't about free will. It's about control through fear. For generations, this fear has been used to silence questioning believers, keep people trapped in toxic religious environments, and push the idea that doubt itself is dangerous. Because when your entire faith is built on fear of punishment, is it really faith or is it coercion? Some sins are unforgivable. Mark chapter 3. Christians say God forgives all sins, that no matter what you've done, if you truly repent, God's grace is big enough to cover it. But then Jesus completely contradicts this idea. He says, truly I tell you, people can be forgiven all their sins and every slander they utter, but whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will never be forgiven. They are guilty of an eternal sin. Wait, never forgiven? So let's get this straight. Murder, forgiven. Slavery, forgiven. Genocide, forgiven. Blasphemy against the Holy Spirit? Nah, that's eternal damnation. Now, does that sound like justice? Does that sound like a morally perfect God? Or does it sound like a system designed to keep people in fear? For centuries, religious leaders have used this idea to silence doubt. Be careful what you say, you might commit the one sin God won't forgive. Don't question too much or you'll cross a line that you can't take back. This isn't about morality, this is about control. Because when an all-powerful God is more offended by words than by actual harm done to people, maybe it was never about forgiveness in the first place. I speak in parables so they won't understand. Mark chapter 4. Christians say Jesus wanted everyone to be saved, that his message was for the whole world, clear, accessible, and universal. But according to Jesus himself, he said the secret of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but to those on the outside, everything is said in parables so that they may be ever seeing but never perceiving, and ever hearing but never understanding. Otherwise, they might turn and be forgiven. Now let's break this down. Jesus deliberately spoke in parables, not to help people understand, but to prevent them from understanding. Why? So that they wouldn't be forgiven. Now, how does that make sense? If Jesus' mission was to bring salvation to everybody, why would he go out of his way to make sure some people didn't get it? Imagine a teacher who gives students an exam full of riddles, not to challenge them, but to guarantee they fail. And then says, well, you didn't figure it out, guess you have to suffer forever. That's not love. That's manufactured exclusivity. This isn't about saving the lost. This is about gatekeeping salvation. Throughout history, elite groups have always controlled knowledge. Priests kept sacred text out of the hands of common people. Scholars controlled access to hidden wisdom. Religious leaders determined who was worthy of deeper truth. Jesus wasn't revealing anything. He was restricting access to it. And if a message designed to save people is deliberately obscured, then maybe it was never meant to save everyone in the first place. As a reminder, Jesus taught to love thy neighbor. He never said love everyone. Go and make disciples of all nations. Matthew chapter 28. Of all the things Jesus said, this one changed the world the most. This one command shaped Christianity's rise to power, leading to colonization, forced conversions, and religious violence. Here's what Jesus told his followers. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. Let's be clear, this isn't a suggestion. This is a directive, a mission, a command to conquer, to convert the world, to baptize them into submission, and to teach them to obey. And this is exactly how Christianity spread, not through peaceful persuasion, but through force. This is where forced conversions began. This is why Christian nations justified colonization. This is why missionaries still treat indigenous cultures as lost souls instead of equals. This isn't love. This is religious colonization. Christianity wasn't just about faith, it was about empire. European explorers carried the Bible in one hand and the sword in the other. Indigenous cultures were told their gods were false and their traditions demonic. Entire civilizations were destroyed in the name of Jesus. And today, this same doctrine fuels evangelical movements that view saving souls as a moral duty, religious groups that infiltrate governments to enforce biblical laws, Christian nationalism that seeks to impose religious dominance. Jesus didn't bring peace, he brought an ideology that demanded control. And if your faith can't survive without forcing others to follow it, was it ever about truth, or was it always about power? So what does all this mean? It means Christians have been sold a rebranded, sanitized version of Jesus. The Jesus of the Bible, the one in the Gospels, encouraged hate for family, used fear to control people, gate-kept salvation from those who didn't understand his message, demanded absolute loyalty at all costs, and laid the groundwork for religious colonization. Now tell me, if anyone today said these things, would we call him God, or would we recognize him for exactly what he was? A cult leader. And that's the real mischaracterization of Jesus. Not that he was a gentle savior, but that we've ignored how much power, control, and fear were central to his teachings. If you have some time during the mornings, join the Daily Atheist Morning Show where you can see Ryan Kotastic giving the daily theocracy watch like this one about a Trump-linked pastor, and the scripture of the day with me where I highlight some of the Bible's most disturbing stories like this one in Judges. And if this breakdown opened your eyes, then you need to see my recent video, God's Plan is Killing Your Potential. Here's how religion steals your power. Click it now. I'll see you there. And until next time, keep rising. What if I told you that the most dangerous cult in America isn't hiding in the woods, it's hiding in plain sight, and most of us were raised in it? What if Christianity isn't just a religion, but the most normalized death cult in America? Think of scriptures such as to live is Christ, to die is gain. Christianity has an obsession with death, not just with what happens after we die, not just with the image of a man tortured on a cross, but with the belief that death is the answer to pain, to injustice, to identity, to meaning. For a lot of us, especially in Black communities, that belief was fed to us as love. It showed up in our funerals, our worship, our prayers, and our parenting. We didn't question it because it was everywhere, because we were taught that suffering was holy and this life wasn't our home. But what if we've been trained to worship suffering, to fear critical thinking, to long for an end instead of building a bridge to better? And what if that obsession with death, not just in fringe cults, but in mainstream Christianity, has quietly prepared generations of people to accept violence as righteousness, authoritarianism as order, and Christian nationalism as a holy mission? I'm not here to attack your grandma's faith. I'm here to name what's hurting us. Because until we confront the death cult at the heart of American Christianity, we will keep feeding generations into systems that rob them of joy, purpose, and power, all in the name of salvation. So let's talk about it plainly, carefully, and without flinching. What exactly is a death cult? So let's ground this conversation. A death cult is usually defined as a group, religious, spiritual, ideological, or even political, that centers its beliefs, rituals, or identity around death, dying, or sacrifice. It's not just that they believe in an afterlife or that they talk about death, it's how they glorify it. They make it sacred. They make it necessary. Sometimes they even make it a requirement. In death cults, suffering becomes salvation. Martyrdom is the goal. And life, this life, it's just something to get through, or escape from, or sacrifice for something greater. The leaders are often charismatic, demanding absolute loyalty, and they control who lives, who dies, and who's considered pure, authentic, are truly loyal. And most death cults believe the world is ending anyway, so why bother fixing anything? Why build? Why heal? Why protect the planet or democracy or each other for that matter, if destruction is inevitable and holy? When you hear it like that, it's easy to think of the obvious: Jonestown, Heaven's Gates, the Branch Davidians. But I want to challenge you to consider something deeper. What if mainstream American Christianity has been operating under these exact same patterns, just with better branding? So let's look at the characteristics of a death cult and ask ourselves honestly, how many of these match the faith we were taught to defend? There are 7 characteristics of a death cult that I want to point out here and how Christianity mirrors them. There's the glorification of death. In a death cult, death isn't just a fact of life, it's the goal. It's sacred. It's celebrated. It's the ultimate win. Sound familiar? Again, to live is Christ, to die is gain. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. Jesus died for you. What are you willing to die for? In Christianity, death isn't just the end of life, it's the gateway to glory. And the message is clear. Earth is corrupt. The body is sinful. The afterlife is everything. That glorification seeps into everything, from funerals that feel like praise parties to songs that beg Jesus to take us home. There's also an obsession with the afterlife or ultimate sacrifice. Death cults often obsess over what happens next, the reward, the paradise, the cosmic payoff, and they elevate sacrifice as the highest form of love. In Christianity, it's almost impossible to separate belief from afterlife obsession. Heaven is the goal, hell is the threat, salvation is the contract that preserves the afterlife experience. And dying for the gospel is the badge of honor. This is why martyrs are canonized, while people who choose life, peace, pleasure, presence are often viewed as weak, worldly, or lost. We're taught to look past life and focus on what comes after, while those lost people continue to press humanity forward. There's also the authoritarian or charismatic leadership. Death cults are usually led by someone who claims exclusive authority or access to truth and demands loyalty. In Christianity, we call them pastors, bishops, apostles, or even prophets. They say things like, "Touch not my anointed," or "Believe in the prophets, so shall you prosper." They say questioning leadership is rebellion. They tell you God speaks to them, and if you don't submit, you're out of alignment, you're out of purpose. And what happens to people who challenge that system? They're silenced, they're shunned, they're shamed, sometimes even called deceived, sometimes even blamed for the judgment that comes on the group. That's not spiritual covering, that's social control. But there's also the apocalyptic worldview. Death cults believe the world is going to end, and not only that, they welcome it. It's not just a prophecy, it's a hope for them, a cleansing fire, a divine reset. Christianity is built around this. We're living in the last days, they say. This world is not our home. Jesus is coming back soon, and this time with a sword. No more water, fire next time. And if the world's going to end anyway, then why care about justice? Why fight for climate solutions, public health, or human rights? That's how you end up with people cheering on destruction because they think it's all a part of God's plan. There's also isolation and indoctrination. In death cults, outsiders are enemies. Doubt is dangerous. Questions are threats. Be not unequally yoked. Avoid worldly wisdom. Lean not on your own understanding, says Scripture. Don't question God's ways, which is not in Scripture, but the people of the book seem to say it a lot. Many Christians are taught to fear outsiders, suppress questions, and rely solely on doctrine. This is why so many people jump into my comments to warn others, don't listen to this man. Even family members are seen as dangerous if they don't believe. This isn't just spiritual protection, it's intellectual isolation. There's also the control over life and death decisions. In some cults, leaders decide who lives, who dies, who gets healed, and who gets shamed. In Christianity, that control often looks like teaching people not to seek therapy. Just pray about it. Demonizing medication, it's just a lack of faith. Shaming suicide victims, but then calling death gain. Telling people of the pride community that they're better off dead than affirmed. Let's not forget how many people have literally died because they followed Christian teachings that have told them to have faith instead of seeking real help. Rejection of the physical world is another major characteristic of death cults. Death cults often teach that the body is evil, the earth is temporary, and the material world is just a trap. Christianity has perfected this narrative. The flesh is weak. This life is but a vapor. Deny yourself. Crucify your flesh. Store up treasures in heaven. Don't love the world or the things in it. And this one kind of gets me. And so I have to take a sidestep and go off script a little bit here. Of course, you cannot take it with you. Do not love the things of this world because you can't store them up in heaven. But what about the children that you brought in this world that you did not leave an inheritance for? That is the problem with that type of thinking. And that is how you produce generational poverty over and over again, by having people who consume everything they have with the understanding that I can't take it with me anyway, and who cares about those kids that I brought into this world? Back to regularly scheduled programming. So people are taught to detach from their bodies, ignore their needs, and endure suffering as proof of faith. The result? Generations of people who've never been taught how to enjoy life because they were raised to believe that joy, rest, and embodiment were distractions. When you lay it all out like that, it's hard to deny. Christianity, as many of us know it, checks every box of a death cult. And not just on the fringe, not just in some backwoods compound, but right there in your neighborhood church, right there in your children's Bible. So the question is, what has that done to us? Now I want to talk about how death cult doctrine reshaped our minds and our lives. Because let's be clear, this isn't just about theology, it's about the psychological and sociological damage that happens when a death cult belief system is normalized over generations, especially in Black communities where the church isn't just a spiritual hub, but is often seen as the cultural center, the authority, the tradition, the inheritance even. So when Christianity teaches us that life is temporary, that pain is divine, that joy is suspicious, that affects how we think, how we live, and what we believe we deserve. Here's what happens when you're exposed to that kind of doctrines for years or even decades. It dulls or disables critical thinking functionality through fear, control, and guilt. It devalues the ability to enjoy life. Joy becomes suspicious or sinful. Personal purpose is suppressed or externally defined. Emotional health is damaged by fear, shame, and emotional numbing. Connection to others is undermined by isolation and detachment, and your sense of self is often shattered or never allowed to form in the first place. This is why so many Christian women experience the sense of losing themselves in relationships. The truth is, they never actually formed their sense of self. And here's the thing, many of us have never known life outside of that framework. We were born into it, raised to believe that our suffering made us holy and our joy made us selfish. We were told that pleasure is dangerous, questioning is rebellion, and self-love is pride. We grew up learning how to pray, but never how to feel safe in our own bodies. We were trained to surrender, to obey, to endure, but never to think, choose, or heal. This is not just religious trauma, it's cultural conditioning, passed down like scripture, enforced like law, and normalized like tradition. And when we zoom out, we can start to see what this has done, not just to individuals, but to entire communities. And there has been a long-term cost in the Black community. This is where it gets personal, because it's one thing to talk about death cults in theory. It's another to look at what these beliefs have done to Black people for generations in a country already built on our exploitation. Christianity was not just handed to us, it was enforced, weaponized, first through the Bible in one hand, chains in the others, and later through songs, sermons, and Sunday schools that sanctified suffering and trained us to find peace in pain. Let's break down how this death-centered doctrine has played out in real life, especially across Black American communities. Critical thinking is often discouraged. Questioning doctrine equals rebellion against God. We were taught to fear knowledge, especially if it challenged the Bible, and that fear kills our curiosity before it can even bloom. Skepticism, that's a demon. Philosophy, that's worldly. Science, be careful, or you will lose your religion. The impact of this is that generations of brilliant minds were trained to defend myths instead of dismantling systems. We taught apologetics before we ever learned actual history. And this is how you get into the glorification of suffering. In so many Black churches, suffering is spiritualized. Poverty, that's a test. Trauma, that's your cross to bear. Depression, baby, just pray harder. We've been taught to romanticize the grind, spiritualize the pain, and call it faith. This becomes a cultural script. Healing feels like rebellion, therapy feels like weakness, and joy feels like disobedience. This leads to deferred liberation. Heaven becomes the answer to injustice, not reparations, not revolution, just endurance. We were told freedom would come later, in the sweet by and by. So instead of building systems that liberate us, we've spent generations building choirs and waiting rooms. Generations delay or abandon the fight for tangible material liberation because they've been trained to wait. Revolution gets replaced with revival. This also has an impact on identity formation. When you're told you were born in sin, that your flesh is wicked, and that your body is a battleground, how do you even learn to love yourself? Especially in a racist society that already tells you you're worthless. Now your religion says it too? Our children grow up never knowing what it means to feel whole. They don't know their worth unless it's filtered through obedience, shame, sacrifice, or somebody else's salvation. These aren't just theological side effects, these are cultural consequences. They shape how we live, how we dream, how we organize, and what we believe is even possible. And the truth is, we've seen this pattern before. When people internalize a theology of death, it doesn't just stay in their minds or their pews or their pulpits. Eventually, it becomes the politics of the day. By now, it should be clear. Christianity, as many of us inherited it, doesn't just center death. It glorifies suffering, demands submission, suppresses thoughts, and waits for the world to end. But when that kind of belief system gains political power, it doesn't just stay in the church, it becomes law, it becomes policy, it becomes violence in God's name. That's how Christian nationalism was born, not as a corruption of Christianity, but as its natural evolution in a society built on racial hierarchy, patriarchy, and religious domination. Let's break down exactly how death cult doctrine laid the groundwork for the rise of nationalism. Death cult doctrine creates a martyr mindset. Take up your cross. Be willing to die for the gospel. Persecution is proof that you're righteous. Those aren't just metaphors, they're dog whistles that create a worldview where opposition equals validation. So when people push back on harmful ideas like banning books, erasing queer people, or forcing childbirth, Christian nationalists don't see that as accountability. They see it as proof that they're chosen. This is how they frame dominance as defense. Every resistance is persecution. Every pushback is spiritual war, and that war justifies real violence. Anti-life theology makes authoritarianism seem righteous. Mainstream Christianity teaches that humans are depraved, the world is evil, and only God and His appointed can rule justly. So the idea of a democracy, or consent, or even nuance, that's seen as soft, corrupt, or chaotic. Christian nationalists don't want freedom, they want control, and they want order, and that order comes from God's law, not the people. That's how you end up with people calling dictators anointed. That's how you excuse cruelty as divine discipline, and that's how a country can start to look like a theocracy in a business suit. End times thinking justifies destruction. They say things like Jesus is coming back any day now, the world is going to burn, it's gonna get worse before it gets better. These beliefs create a fatalistic mindset where the world is supposed to fall apart, and there's no need to stop it. Climate change, part of prophecy. Civil war, God's purging the wicked. Voting rights, God's judgment on a rebellious nation. Christian nationalism thrives in this mindset because it gives people permission to abandon justice, ignore suffering, and embrace collapse. Furthermore, the glorification of the cross makes sacrifice seem noble, even when it's violent. Christianity teaches that God demanded blood, that suffering redeems, that pain is holy if it's for the right cause. That belief trains people to see violence as sacred if it's done in the name of purity, order, or truth. This is how laws that harm real people, queer folk, black folk, women folk, immigrants, non-believers, this is how they get framed as love. The cross stops being a symbol of compassion and becomes a badge of moral superiority. And then you get to this place where loyalty to doctrine is considered greater than empathy for people, where you say things like God is love, but He'll send your ass to hell. Loving someone means correcting their sin. truth matters more than your feelings. Christianity often teaches ideological loyalty over human flourishing. That's how Christian nationalists can deny trans people care, take away bodily autonomy, erase entire identities, and still feel like they're loving people. Because in their minds, loyalty to doctrine is compassion, and empathy becomes a threat. These words have literally been said. So they begin using language such as we're under attack for our faith. We need God's law to control people. We're justified in destroying systems. They're doomed. Cleansing the nation is holy work. God's truth matters more than your feelings or your rights. After all of the monstrosities committed by Christianity, how do we not realize that biblical doctrine is literally the makings of a monster 101? So no, Christian nationalism isn't some new extremist movement. It's the logical outcome of centuries of death-obsessed theology, authoritarian teaching, and apocalyptic indoctrination. It's not a political hijacking, it's the social consequence of tolerating death doctrines. So I want to ask this question: what could be gained if we let go? If everything I've said so far feels heavy, it's because it is. We've inherited a theology that taught us to romanticize pain, worship obedience, fear our own questions, and wait for heaven while the world falls apart. But what if we let that go? What if we stopped calling death a reward, stopped calling silence obedience, stopped calling trauma God's will, and just started living? Imagine if all of the energy we've spent waiting for Jesus, glorifying suffering, and defending the Bible was rerouted into something that actually helped people heal. What could we build instead? Perhaps cooperative businesses that prioritize people over politics. Maybe community-based education that values curiosity over conformity. Or maybe even ethical frameworks rooted in compassion, not commandments. Maybe joy-centered spaces that celebrate life, art, and rest, therapy and body work that helps us process generations of grief. And maybe we get to the place where we elevate critical thinkers over charismatic performers. Maybe we get to a place where our children are safe to ask real questions, even ones that seem dangerous. We don't even know what our communities are capable of because so much of our collective imagination has been outsourced to the sky. But the truth is, we are here. We exist. We matter, and we don't need a death cult to tell us that. We need a new imagination, one that honors this life, one that celebrates this body, one that sees joy, justice, and curiosity as sacred. It's not enough to leave the church. We have to leave the theology that told us we weren't worthy of life by design. So let's stop pretending this is just about faith. Let's stop pretending this is just about heaven. Let's stop pretending that this is just about church. This is about a belief system that taught people to glorify death, fear freedom, and submit to power, all in the name of God. It's about a doctrine that told enslaved people to wait for heaven and told their descendants that suffering makes them holy, while building entire systems that depend on them never getting up. It's about how the same theology that taught us to love the cross now justifies the flag, and how a death-obsessed religion has become the emotional engine of American domination. That's why this matters, because Christian nationalism didn't hijack Christianity. It's the inevitable outcome of death cult doctrine played out in politics, policies, and pulpits, and the only way to stop it is to confront the theology that gave it permission. So if you grew up in this system, you're not crazy for feeling like something was off. You're not wrong for questioning it. You're not bitter. You're not even broken. You're finally seeing it for what it is. The church taught us how to die. Now we get to learn how to live. Not in fear, not in guilt, not in silence, but in truth. With our minds intact, our bodies whole, and our futures back in our hands. I hope you've gotten some value from this conversation today. Until next time, keep rising.
Donald Trump is the most Christian president in American history. Work with me here. Because both times that he was elected, evangelical Christians were one of his most influential and supportive voting blocs. And he hasn't been shy about courting Christians.
God spared my life for a reason.
To a large extent, he's delivered on the promises that he made to his evangelical base. He helped end Roe, he let religious organizations avoid the Affordable Care Act's contraception requirements, and of course, he's systematically wiping out any mention of trans folks, a favorite cudgel of many evangelicals. And to top it off, he signed an executive order declaring an end to anti-Christian bias. Because of course, when you think of the most persecuted religious group in the US, evangelical Christians really leap to mind. Now, Trump and Christianity have always seemed like an odd partnership.
Old Testament guy or New Testament guy?
Probably equal.
Jesus constantly talked about loving your enemies, supporting the least of these, living in a way filled with love.
Sell all your belongings and give the money to the poor.
Mr. Trump, well, his hobby of extramarital affairs and shady business deals doesn't exactly scream Christian values.
Is she your wife? You know what? I would say she's a beautiful woman, but if I did say that, my political career, you're not allowed to say that.
You know, the very mention of things like love and mercy seem to make him squirm.
They may not be citizens or have the proper documentation, but the vast majority of immigrants are not criminals.
So how has he become a hero, even a leader for American Christians? Well, there's two people who can help us explain the rise of Trump and Christianity. One is Friedrich Nietzsche. The other is Paula White.
The longer the dance, the more bees she gets aroused. So Queen Bee starts going into this frenzy.
If you haven't heard of her, just wait. She's more fun than a barrel of monkeys. Okay, let's start by clarifying which brand of Christians have anointed Trump as the second coming. Now, some of his most vocal supporters have been Christian nationalists, and specifically white Christian nationalists. And it's easy to listen to the news and feel like these white Christian nationalists are some shadowy conspiratorial society threatening our democracy's very existence. Well, you wouldn't be totally wrong to think that, but Christian nationalism itself is a sort of debatable moniker. Researchers tend to disagree about what Christian nationalism even is or the degree to which it functions as a coherent ideology. In fact, a report published by the Pew Research Foundation in January wrote that there is no universally accepted definition of religious nationalism, which makes it hard to have a clear definition of what makes someone a Christian nationalist. But they elaborate that in order to be defined as a Christian nationalist, you would have to agree with 4 principles. The first is that being a Christian is very important to being truly American. And it is very important that the US president share their beliefs, and the Bible should have at least some influence over US laws, and when the Bible conflicts with the will of the people, the Bible should have more influence. Pew found that by these measures, just 6% of US adults consider themselves Christian nationalists. And we can take this in 2 ways, right? Either, so maybe there aren't actually many Christian nationalists, or maybe a lot of folks practicing a type of faith that's in line with nationalism, even if they're not consciously aware of it.
We take our authority over this election. Jesus is Lord.
And while there's a lot to unpack in that list, nothing here is all that different than what the old moral majority or Christian right has stood for decades, back when Billy Graham was praying on the White House lawn. Now, evangelical Christians have preferred candidates that reflect biblical values, like an emphasis on family values, opposition to abortion and gay rights, and support for prayer in schools. So if Christians say the Bible is so important to them, then why did they help elect a guy who's more interested in it as a prop rather than as a sacred text?
The Bible means a lot to me, but I don't want to get into specifics.
In the 1960s, sociologist Robert Bellah argued that much of the way Americans talk about their country echoes the way Christians talk about their faith, and he deems this worldview a civil religion. Now, America doesn't have an official religion, technically, but civil religion is infused with vibes and rituals of Christianity. So in this civil religion, we get sacred text like the Declaration of Independence, sacred symbols like the American flag, and of course we get sacred leaders like Abraham Lincoln and the Founding Fathers. But there's also a conception of America as the promised land, the establishment of a new social order that shall be a light unto all nations.
God spared my life for a reason, and that reason was to save our country and to restore America to greatness.
Now, Bellah describes the civil religion as a genuine vehicle of national religious self-understanding. And indeed, our political language is infused with this American exceptionalism that relies on God favoring the American people and the ostensible American way of life. To the degree civil religion has a God, it's less concerned with the Sermon on the Mount and more concerned with the U.S. being a city on a hill, a shining beacon of prosperity and freedom. Now, in the decades since Bellah's article, and as Christian leaders have sought more influence in politics, you could argue that civil religion has become more more religious, while Christianity has become more civil or political. In the 2000s, when the culture started shifting to the left, we saw expanded rights granted to the LGBTQ community, women's health care, and minorities. Christian leaders began to describe this as an affront to God and a symptom of America in decline. So when Trump uses rhetoric about anti-Christian bias, and Christians claim that their religious freedom is under attack, well, it's likely not their faith, but the civil expression of that faith that they see as under attack. But you know who saw all of this coming? Your friend and mine, Friedrich Nietzsche, who compares Christianity to a slave morality defined by its resentment, which is a type of resentment. In The Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche describes a noble morality and a slave morality. And he says the slave morality is based on the idea of no. He calls no the creative deed. He goes on to say, in order to exist, slave morality always first needs a hostile external world. It needs, physiologically speaking, external stimuli in order to act at all. Its action is fundamentally reaction. Now, by asserting its own victimization, Christianity establishes the grounds of its existence, which breeds a kind of anger and resentment, and then wields that anger as a tool for power. And when you're a religion or a political party identified by what you're against, it becomes really hard to shed that vibe when you actually win. And we can see this in how the current Republican Party behaves. Like, they're the party in power, and you get scenes like this one.
Can't trust the government anymore.
Having access to personal data.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
You are the government.
And of course, there's the reactions to Kendrick Lamar's Super Bowl performance, which spun conservatives into a rage because they might have power, but they're still not very cool. Political rhetoric in the US has always had echoes of civil religion, but this turn towards resentment has been brewing since the civil rights movement. Now, Christian leaders like Jerry Falwell spoke out against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, claiming that it was a violation of human and private property rights. In the mid-2000s, the idea that gay marriage could become legalized or that a healthcare law may contain a mandate to cover contraceptives all became fodder for Christians to claim that their religious freedom was under threat. Because if I'm an evangelical Christian and someone uses birth control 100 miles away, my soul dies. This psychology is all exemplified in things like the God's Not Dead series of movies. If you're a sicko like me and you want to know more about them, we've made videos on all of those movies. You can check them out. But this all adds up to the idea that the real threat to humanity isn't climate change or, I don't know, nuclear apocalypse. It's the liberals. But how does this all explain Trump's unlikely rise to figurehead of this civil religion? Before we get into it, I need to tell you about something. Spam. Now, spam has taken over all of our lives. You know, all those constant calls about your car's extended warranty and emails claiming that you want a gift card and it floods your inbox every single day. If you've ever wondered how spammers get your info, I know I have. It's because they probably bought it. Because there's a whole market out there that many of us aren't aware of where our personal information gets bought and sold. They know your name, your age, where you live, your phone number, your email address, what you buy online, even your browsing history. You have the right to demand that your name and information be taken off these lists, but the process can be pretty complicated and time-consuming, which brings me to the sponsor of today's video, Incogni. Now, Incogni is a service that helps you fight back against data brokers and remove your information from their databases. And here's how it works, right? So you give Incogni permission to act on your behalf, and they go find those lists that you're on and demand you be taken off. I've started using Incogni a while back, and oh boy, am I already seeing the positive effects. They've already contacted hundreds of data brokers on my behalf, and over the past few weeks, I've received considerably less spam emails, text, and calls. I also get to track the progress Incogni is making for me on their dashboard, so I can see how many requests they've sent out, how many have been successful, and how many that they're still working on. Now, if you want to check it out for yourself, click the link in the description, and when you do, you're going to get 60% off their annual plan, which I really recommend, because having Incogni to keep an eye out for you throughout the year is going to ensure that your data stays off the market as they carry out repeated removals to take it down if it shows up again. So click the link in the description and get 60% off the annual subscription to keep your data secure. Now, let's get back to the show. Journalist Sarah Posner argues that this resentment and erosion over America's decline as a moral leader hit its apex during Barack Obama's tenure as president. She writes that, primed by conspiracy theories about Obama's place of birth, his race, and his religion, from the outset, many in the movement were ready to believe that he was poised to eviscerate their freedom and crush Christianity. Every move as president, real and imagined, was fodder for these superstitions. Now, the most potent of these conspiracy theories, that Obama was not really American, was fittingly championed by Trump. In him, the Christian right found a figure who forcefully voiced the same resentment as they did. You know, it doesn't hurt that Trump is famously resentful of anyone who doesn't agree with his views or that criticizes him publicly. His main driving force seems to be undermining or destroying anyone who personally offends him or opposes his policies or implicates him in crimes. So Christian leaders sort of found a kindred and kindredly resentful spirit in Trump. When Trump talked about America in decline, Christian leaders agreed. And when Trump famously said this in his convention,
I alone can fix it.
he tapped into the Christian desire for a savior who can deliver the chosen people from their suffering. What's more, Trump becomes not just a symbol for the Christian right, but he embraces their embrace of him. You know what I mean? Like, he doesn't just accept it, he loves it. But there's also another thing that's going on here, and it's a shift within Christianity itself to embrace a thing called the prosperity gospel. Now, what started out as a fringe movement has gone fully mainstream, with some studies pegging the number of Protestants who believe in this form of Christianity as high as 50%. It's even found its way into pop culture with books like The Secret. This is the belief that God wants you, yes you, to be wealthy, prosperous, and healthy. But theologically, it holds the notion that revelation supersedes things like facts and reason, and that one's authority is imbued with things like the supernatural powers to heal and even lift people out of poverty. So it's like cool if people get out of poverty if magic does it, but not if policy does it. I get it. This is why televangelists present themselves as anointed leaders who are modern day prophets and apostles. And you know who loves this whole vibe? Donald Trump. Now, Posner describes how during his first campaign, Trump struck up a friendship with the televangelist and prosperity gospel preacher Paula White. Trump found her messages of success to be appealing, and in Trump, Paula White saw the fulfillment of everything the prosperity gospel preaches.
And every demonic altar that has been erected against him will be torn down.
So in Trump, we get this weird, powerful amalgamation of different narratives of Christianity that carry echoes of civil religion, resentment, racism, and now the prosperity gospel. Who would have thought it would all come together like this? You know what? Trump friggin' loves it. In his embrace of Christianity and the prosperity gospel, he's become a secular version of everything the prosperity gospel believes. He's rich. He demands absolute loyalty, and he promises that he alone can save us. He might have only recently proclaimed himself a king, but he's been giving off godlike vibes for a while. Posner writes that his pronouncements are not to be questioned, and his followers believe he will, supernaturally or otherwise, make America great again. They believe Trump will achieve MAGA because God has anointed him to carry out this mission. He may not actually be a Christian, but God has chosen him to protect Christians and therefore America. When Christians are fed a message of constant suppression of free expression of religion, and then that gets combined with a figure who preys on the psychological persecution of those Christians, well, you get strange but oddly suitable bedfellows. That's all for this one, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Please do leave a comment. Let us know what you think. Subscribe if you haven't already. Huge shout out to our patrons. There's a link in the description if you feel like joining. And in the meantime, walk in peace, my children. Capitalism is over. So, what comes next? Techno-feudalism. Now, if that sounds sinister, well, yeah, it should. Techno-feudalism describes an economy that is slowly regressing to medieval times, where we're becoming serfs, tilling the digital land owned by our Silicon Valley feudal lords. And the end game of this project is replacing democratic governments with privatized and non-democratic digital spaces. One tech billionaire is already ahead of the curve in making this vision a reality.
This is what victory feels like.
I mean, come on, you had to see that one coming. Who was surprised with that? It's always him. It's always you, Alon. The world's richest man has been hard at work manifesting this dark, new post-capitalist order. He announced his support for a German far-right party in an upcoming election and agreed with their leader that pro-Palestinian activists are basically Nazis. He accused the leader of the British Labour Party of covering up large-scale sex crimes and then argued that the US should liberate the UK. British friends, shout it out in the comments if you want me to come liberate you. I'll be on my way. And he's been acting like Trump's assistant regional manager, living in a $2,000 a night Mar-a-Lago bungalow and running a made-up government agency. Oh, and he's also using the social media platform that he owns to do hate speech. Now, it's easy to attribute this bizarre behavior to general billionaire megalomania. But that risks missing the point. All of his actions connect to the larger project of using digital space to subvert governments and command increasing control over our lives. Okay, so What is techno-feudalism, and how are folks like Musk using their influence to push not just the United States, but the entire world in this direction? Now, to understand, I first need to talk about feudalism, which is a pre-industrial system in which you were either born landed gentry, meaning that you owned land, or a serf, meaning that you worked the land. And because land was something you inherited, there was no way to climb the ladder from serfdom into gentry, no bootstraps in that world. There was no market price on the land. But with economic changes in the 19th century, land became a more valuable commodity on the emerging market. So landlords kicked the serfs out and invited them to come back and exchange their labor for money, creating whatever goods were desirable on the beautiful market. Now, this marked the creation of enclosures, in which peasants were kicked off the land their family had worked for generations, fenced out of their previous homes. They now worked for wages and had to pay rent. In other words, it was capitalism time. Now, while we're not moving back onto parcels of land owned by feudal lords, much of our lives is spent on apps and in other digital spaces that we do not own. If you do own a digital space, however, just consider signing up for our Patreon. There's a link in the description. We would love to take your money. Now, this often involves digital forms of enclosures, and we're creating value for the owners of these enclosures every time we read the news, catch up with friends, or order dinner. Techno-feudalism describes this cloud-based way of life where we've become serfs who live on the terrain of Silicon Valley billionaires. And much like the serfs before us, we don't really have a choice, as so much of modern existence requires use of these digital spaces. Like, really think about it. If you were going to throw your phone away, get off the internet, not use apps, what would you do? A lot of stuff would be really hard. If you've done that, don't let us know, because you're not here, because you wouldn't be watching this. According to McManahan, Strachan, and Forno, techno-feudalism suggests our preferences are no longer our own. They're manufactured by machine networks. It's underpinned by the theory that the cloud has created a feedback loop that removes our agency. We train the algorithm to find what we like, and then the algorithm trains us to like what it offers. I don't know what this says, but I'm getting this Instagram ad recently that's like, how to be a good dad even if you have ADHD. And it's like, Jesus Christ, you're targeting me with a thing that's like, your specific neurodivergency is making you a bad dad, but you need to do this to be a good dad. It's crazy. So not only are we dependent on cloud-based networks, but the more we engage with them, the more we need them, and the more they sort of own us. Now, you might think that President Musk's recent political activity indicates a desire to use traditional systems of government to gain power, but it's actually the opposite. He's using the government to undermine the very power of government. Trump's even promised him his own government agency, DOGE, or Department of Government Efficiency, with the precise goal of eliminating wasteful government spending. And this plays into the recent trend in which governments are giving up more and more of their power to private tech contractors. This increasingly looks like previously public services, everything from transportation, the post office, libraries, education, becoming enclosed by private corporations. And this isn't an exclusively right-wing move, as the guy who really married big tech to government was none other than Barack Obama, because he hoped that we could change America to be a Silicon Valley hellhole. Lucy Green writes that there was a revolving door between the Obama administration and tech giants. A host of ex-Obama staffers went on to work for Lyft and other Silicon Valley giants, with some helping craft legislation that basically favors digital landlords while taking rights from the new serfs. In other words, it gives companies a lot of power and makes it where if you're a Lyft driver, you don't have real labor rights. It's established an incestuous relationship between government power and tech influence. Green writes that Silicon Valley is now better positioned than most industries to wield political influence, and in ways we have not seen before. It is at once government vendor, collaborator, sponsor, advisor, communicator, rival, and enemy on any given day. More and more government contracts are going to Silicon Valley, especially in military and communications technology. Consider how NASA, rather than investing in its own R&D, now buys Musk's rockets and satellites. This turns the agency from something that is at least in theory about the public good into a mechanism for enriching Musk. According to Green, tech companies are exacerbating all the pressures on the government, which is both eroding revenues and undermining their strength. And Yanis Varoufakis notes that as with the original enclosures, some form of fence would be necessary to keep the masses out of such an important resource. In the 18th century, it was land that many were denied access to. In the 21st century, it is access to our own identity. This is because just to participate in this new cloud-based kingdom, we're constantly trading our identity and personal data for admission. You know, this data is collected whether you're driving your Tesla or you're posting on the app formerly known as Twitter. And then you're fed ads that imply that if you have ADHD, you can't be a good dad. This means that Musk is completing a project that was initiated and endorsed by Obama and a whole bunch of liberal politicians. So don't say woke crack or anything, guys. I'm saying bad stuff about Obama and those guys, but then you'll just be mad at that. You guys are hard to please. But Musk is going beyond simply trying to make America Silicon Valley again. He's trying to take this project global. You know, it's not dissimilar from the pre-industrial land grabs and expansions that would expand the territories of feudal lords to give them more power and control. France's president recently said this about Musk. 10 years ago, who would have imagined that the owner of one of the world's largest social networks would be supporting a new international reactionary movement and intervening directly in elections, including in Germany? He was joined by Norway's prime minister, who said, "I find it worrying that a man with enormous access to social media and huge economic resources involves himself so directly in the internal affairs of other countries." Sort of like the unmarried friend who gives you like marriage advice, or the person without a kid that tells you how to parent. It's like, just chill. Just chill. It's not your role. Musk has been a major power player in the Russian-Ukraine war via his Starlink satellites, which Ukraine relies on, and which literally give him the power to undermine their war efforts. In recent months, the most alarming part of Musk's European tour of terror has been his support for the far-right Alternative for Germany party. He recently warned the German people,
"Only AfD can save Germany. End of story." And people really need to get behind the AfD, and otherwise things are going to get very, very much worse in Germany.
Okay, let's take a quick look at this article. It's titled, "Musk Says Only AfD Can Save Germany and Talk with German Populist Leader." And if you just read this headline alone and knew nothing else, you might be like, oh, the AfD, that's probably a political party. Populism, that's just someone who claims to appeal to ordinary people. Surely nothing crazy is going on here. But if you were looking at a headline from a different source covering this same story, you could read something like, Elon Musk to host X event promoting neo-Nazi AfD party ahead of German elections, and think, oh, that's a bad one. And how is it possible that the same story is completely different depending on which source you're getting your news from? You know, many media organizations, well, they prioritize clicks over clear, accurate information. They're reducing complex issues to simple sound bites. That article that I just shared, well, I found that on Ground News, which is where I read my news every day. They're the sponsor of today's video. Their app and website pull stories from across the globe into one place, and it gives you the full picture on every story. This story has been reported by over 300 sources, and we can check out where each one leans politically using their bias distribution chart. You can also check the factuality rating, which scores the reliability of reporting, and even lets you see who owns each source. These factors shape how stories are framed, letting you compare how bias impacts coverage, like we saw in the articles mentioned earlier. Now, one of the things I love about Ground News is their blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately reported by either side of the political spectrum. I don't know about you all, I can get a little trapped in my bubble, following certain people on social media, talking to friends who have similar views as I do, and this feature really helps me step outside that bubble and both discover stories I wouldn't see otherwise, and also see how stories I know about are covered differently. Now, if you want to check it out for yourself, you can head over to ground.news/wisecrack and give it a try. If you use this link, you're going to get 40% off the Vantage plan and get unlimited access to all the features that are going to help you get all the information you need to navigate the news in this increasingly newsworthy time. Now, I think Ground News is doing important work. I do hope that you'll check them out. But for now, let's get back to the show. The party's leader, Eyless, used their conversation to equate Hitler and the Nazis with contemporary communists and socialists, even though Hitler actually put communists into camps.
So he was nothing else than an anti-Semitic socialist. And we are exactly the opposite. We are a libertarian conservative party. We are wrongly framed the entire time.
This isn't just more of Elon being oddly Nazi adjacent, it's an active continuation of the techno-feudalist project. And this was noted by the Green Party candidate from Germany, who said, with his billions upon billions of dollars and unbridled media power, Elon Musk's support for the AfD is not some ignorant whim. He's emboldening those who want to weaken Europe and its rule of law, the very regulations that limit unchecked power. Now, some of you Musk fanboys might argue that all he's doing is encouraging a more libertarian spirit and a sense of free speech absolutism. But according to political philosopher Willem David Blunt, Musk and co. aren't libertarian. They're authoritarian. They're primarily interested in shielding themselves from regulation. They're overlords, wanting to be free of constraint like feudal overlords of the past as divine right of kings. They view themselves arbitrarily as geniuses, and we are buying into it one click at a time, affirming their power. And it makes sense that Musk would work to destabilize Europe with its historical social safety nets and more aggressive regulation of tech companies, including the recent Digital Markets Act, which bars companies from monetizing data collected on mobile apps to help advertisers better target individuals. But you might still be wondering, how does any of this end capitalism? Well, let's think back to the transition from feudalism to industrialism, when the enclosure of land turned everything into market relations. The early open access and publicly funded internet was, over the course of the 90s, sold off for commercial interest, and eventually enclosed by tech companies that consolidated services to extract maximum data and profit from users. But now the shift to techno-feudalism has more to do with power and control than it does market viability. Now, according to Varoufakis, techno-feudalism is qualitatively distinct from capitalism, and thus, as a word, it illuminates crucial aspects of the real world in ways that rentier capitalism, or platform capitalism, or hyper-capitalism cannot. In other words, techno-feudalism breaks from the pure market logic that has driven most tech development until recently. And just like how some of Musk's seemingly erratic political behavior makes more sense in light of the techno-feudalist project, so does his own use of and general encouragement of hate speech. Now, Varoufakis writes, because techno-feudalism's algorithms are known to reinforce patriarchy, stereotypes, and pre-existing oppressions, those who are most vulnerable, girls, the mentally ill, the marginalized, and yes, the poor, suffer the outcome most. In other words, if recklessly using R words and N words and F words on social media reinforces the strength of these platforms, then hey, why not encourage it? And in case you're gonna be like, he doesn't, he did the R one, I'm not gonna say it, but he did it. We recently saw this with Mark Zuckerberg pulling diversity programs out of Meta, along with their content moderation program, which now allows for hate speech. And Zuckerberg has explicitly connected these moves with a renewed call for masculinity and aggression in corporate culture.
It's one thing to say we want to be kind of like welcoming and make a good environment for everyone, and I think it's another to basically say that masculinity is bad.
And it shouldn't shock us that folks like Zuckerberg, Bezos, Musk, Mark Andreessen are all getting in line to serve in Trump's anti-woke army. Now, Varoufakis writes that bigotry is techno-feudalism's emotional compensation for the frustrations and anxieties we experience in relation to identity and focus. He notes that even the most diligent content moderation can't stem all this hate because algorithms optimize for cloud rents, which flow more copiously from hatred and discontent. It's good for business to do hateful stuff, so they're going to keep making it possible to do hateful stuff. Now, Varoufakis also points out that another effect of the techno-feudalist revolution is that we no longer own our own minds. During our working hours, we become cloud proles, putting ourselves into various digital systems. My main one is YouTube. What digital system do you put yourself into? And then when we get home, we become cloud serfs, fueling our own distraction and exploitation. When I'm at home, I still largely fuel YouTube, sometimes other streaming apps, Reddit, Twitter, Instagram. Why don't I read books? I don't know. Now, he writes that while privatization and private equity asset strip all physical wealth around us, cloud capital goes about the business of asset stripping our brains. Whew, take that one in, guys. Cloud capital goes about the business of asset stripping our brains. Where we once both lived and worked on the feudal lord's physical land, the new serfdom takes place in the cloud controlled by the tech overlords, where our minds and very identities are extracted for value. Now, it might feel like we're totally screwed. At this point, that's how I feel. But, according to Varoufakis, the poison might also contain the cure. He writes that collective action is made harder when people have fewer opportunities to come together. But herein lies the great power the cloud capital presents to its potential rebels, a capacity to build coalitions, organize, and take action via the cloud. I guess that's what the comments are for. Get after it. So the very space that we're forced to work as both unpaid laborers and reproducers of the system is also a space where we can band together to rage against the machine. As Bernie Sanders pointed out in a recent interview with Hassan Piker, the techno-feudal takeover of politics disempowers working people as a whole and hollows out what remains of democracy.
You got control of the media by the few, control of the political system by the few, control of the economy by the few. And if that's not oligarchy, I don't know what oligarchy is.
So as Trump takes office, flanked on all sides by those with a clear techno-feudal agenda, the challenge is creatively using those feudal spaces to organize resistance against our new lords. Okay, please let me know what you think below. If you haven't checked it out yet, there is a link to our Patreon community in the description. It's a great way to support the channel, get early videos with no ads, extra perks, access to our Discord server, things of that nature. If you don't have that and you consider subscribing, liking, leaving a comment, it all really helps us. In the meantime, I don't know, try to be a little less surfy this week, and I'll do the same. I'll see you next time. So lately, I've been thinking about how people are going to react when I die.
And now to sing a song, the son of the deceased.
You must gather your party
Friday night.
Now, it'll be one thing if I get struck by lightning while doing a do in a porta potty. And if that's the case, please laugh away. You have my full permission. It's very funny. Post the video online. I don't care. But otherwise, I'd hope that when I meet my mortal end, even my worst enemies will frown and say, you know, he had bad hair and a bad attitude, and he was really pale and kind of sickly looking all the time, but he was nice to servers, and he tipped pretty well to him. And I don't think that's really asking for too much, because as a society, we tend to go pretty easy on people after they kick the bucket. We write musicals about famous artists while forgetting those credible accusations of child molestation. We romanticize presidents who notoriously the bed on every aspect of foreign policy, not to mention made extramarital affairs their secondary profession.
Happy birthday, Mr. President.
We made a nonagenarian playboy the champion of free speech, rather than just some guy that wanted to sell nudes of Marilyn Monroe. And yet, the reaction to Henry Kissinger's recent demise was the digital equivalent of a Taylor Swift concert causing a minor earthquake. To be clear, that wasn't just a metaphor. That's a real thing that happened, by the way. Also, Swifties, I want my bracelets still. Someone said they were going to send me one of the bracelets. I would like a bracelet. And while they weren't actually dancing on the former Secretary of State's grave, many politicians and journalists abandoned conventional decorum, resulting in headlines like Rolling Stone's Henry Kissinger, war criminal beloved by America's ruling class, finally dies.
Give me a hell yeah!
Journalist Spencer Ackerman goes on to write of the brutal Chilean dictator Kissinger's policies brought to power. Pinochet's torture chambers were the maternity ward of neoliberalism. A baby delivered, bloody and screaming, by Henry Kissinger. And to be clear, I'm not going to be diplomatic here. I'm just going to say it. Henry Kissinger was bad. Yep, I'm saying it. Henry Kissinger, bad guy. If you don't listen to me, Anthony Bourdain had a really good quote on that, and everyone seems to like him.
Who once said, once you've been to Cambodia, you'll never stop wanting to beat Henry Kissinger to death with your bare hands.
Now, Kissinger extended the Vietnam War for years solely to get Nixon elected. He catalyzed genocides in East Timor and Bangladesh. He illegally bombed Cambodia and Laos to smithereens. He supported violent insurgencies in southern Africa. Kissinger was basically the kid that did every extracurricular activity in high school, except that all those activities were different types of war crimes. So it's not surprising that some might feel more like hocking a loogie on his coffin than waxing poetic about his positive qualities. If you want to try to list a positive quality of Kissinger in the comments, go for it. But given the way plenty of bad dudes have been romanticized in death, it feels worth asking, why was Henry Kissinger given a uniquely harsh treatment? And for that matter, how does a society decide how to treat the dead? And do we really owe the not so dearly departed our respect? Well, let's find out in this video. Is it okay to speak ill of the dead when their name is Henry Kissinger? Now, our society tends to take a gloves-on approach to death. We still invoke the old adage, don't speak ill of the dead, which historians date back to 6th century BC philosopher Chilon of Sparta, who admonished, of the dead, nothing but good. Of course, Chilon also said, gesticulation in speaking should be avoided as a mark of insanity, which is a proverb that seems to be targeting our Italian friends. So we're sorry, Italians. We're with you on this one. And we also want a bit of the pizza pie. But apart from a Spartan who hated hand gestures, humanity has long been preoccupied with the right way to treat and speak of the dead. Of course, for most of human history, dealing with dead people looked different. In ancient Egypt, elaborate death and mourning rituals weren't just for kicks. They reflected the power wielded by dead people. As historian Julia Trochet writes, the dead in ancient Egypt remained actors whose social capital could be effectively exploited within the social, religious, and political networks of the living. The living would call on the dead for help with everything from finances to fertility, and dead folks were believed to be able to combat illness and injustice. Most notably, the kings were believed to have godlike powers in death, which is why even Angelina Jolie can't get away with raiding their tombs unscathed. The worlds of the living and the dead were similarly porous in the West, in part because death was just sort of everywhere. Life expectancy tapped out at around 30. Plagues could wipe out entire towns overnight, and death was just a lot more intimately familiar. I mean, not least because people usually just died in their own homes. Christianity curbed some of the associated anxiety because it viewed death less as a flashing game over sign
Are you okay?
and more as a next step in the journey of your all-important soul. And the people you left behind felt a lot of responsibility for helping you along that path. As writer Kate Berridge explains, until the mid-16th century, the living believed they could influence the passage of the soul of the deceased. They acted as spiritual caretakers, and with prayers and masses, sought to hasten the soul's departure from purgatory. To that end, those who could afford to would leave posthumous endowments to fund prayers and services, or even entire chapels and designated priests to do the work for their souls. Viewed this way, honoring the dead was paramount, while bad-mouthing them risked keeping them stuck in the eternal DMV waiting room in the sky. But the same concern wasn't always extended to the dead person's body. And unless you were nobility prior to the 16th century, you were likely buried in an unmarked grave or at most given a little wooden cross. This society, like William Martin Joel knew,
It's all about soul.
the Protestant Reformation changed views of death by doing away with the Catholic concept of purgatory. And just a little, history of religion nerd cliff note here. Purgatory wasn't really biblical canon, and the Protestants were all about going by the book. Now, scholar Carlos Eyre calls this a big contributor to the secularization of society, and a significant first step towards the elevation of this world as the ultimate reality and towards the extinction of the soul. In other words, the bond between the living and the dead was extinguished. Most believe that the dead were now just gone for good, so there wasn't much reason to spend tons of time doing masses in their name. And death thus began its slow retreat from everyday life. The Renaissance had also accelerated secularization, which contributed to death's transformation. Individuals, and especially nobility, became more worried about their posthumous honor, or reputation on earth, rather than the fate of their soul. In other words, legacy became everything. The retreat of the soul and the elevation of a person's earthly legacy were both indicative of a culture that prized individuality, also the result of the Protestant Reformation and the Renaissance. Now, being dead, of course, makes it hard to be an individual, or as Carl Jung put it, all the corpses in the world are chemically identical. Your quirky sense of humor or incredible breakdancing chops thus only survive in how the living think, talk, or dance about you. And that's no small burden. As Berridge explains, the greater the celebration of individuality, the sharper death's sting has become. Loss of identity is an insupportable concept, and this is central to the compulsion to commemorate. And what better way to be remembered on Earth than through an obituary? As far back as Roman times, people in the West have written about their newly expired comrades via death notices. But this obituary, as we know it today, didn't really pop off until the mid-19th century newspaper boom. This was the Victorian era, a time of extreme sentimentalism, and obituaries captivated audiences with gruesome, tragic deathbed scenes and over-dramatic lamentations of loss. One iconic example is this one. Within the short period of a year, she was a bride, a beloved wife and companion, a mother, a corpse. Yeah, you didn't see that coming, right? A real reversal at the end. It's like, M. Night Shyamalan wrote that friggin' obituary. As journalism professionalized in the early 20th century, obituaries cut out weeping to give more objective, though generally positive accounts of the person's life, work, and achievements. Undergoing something of a revolution since the 1980s, obituaries have since developed more flair, panache, and opinion. Still, even in their most honest iterations, they tend to blunt unattractive truths. According to journalist Marilyn Johnson's recounting of the standard euphemisms, we all know that "he didn't suffer fools gladly" translates as a complete bastard. Gave colorful counts of his exploits, liar. Powerful negotiator, bully. Affable and hospitable at every hour, chronic alcoholic. One journalist explains the basic humanity behind this inclination. You tend to want to be kind because they're at the end of their life. You want to note the things they did that were good and the things about them that were valuable. In a secular, individualistic world where there's nothing for you after death and all you leave behind is your reputation, that approach to obituaries does seem fundamentally decent. But when it comes to figures who have wielded significant power over our world, calling a liar colorful or a bully a good negotiator has more serious implications. If you doubt that how we talk about the dead matters, consider the fact that good old Ronald Reagan's aides spent a decade preparing the 10-day-long tributes and rituals that memorialized his death in 2004. It was in a project dubbed Operation Serenade, which they called a legacy building event. You know, I just think if you die and you need a legacy building event, you probably weren't building much of a legacy, were you? The media put up little resistance covering the orchestrated commemorations, such that they seem to have emerged spontaneously and surprisingly from ordinary people. While early reporting weighed Reagan's uglier legacy, like his racist attacks on black women who received welfare, or his destruction of the Air Traffic Controller Union, against the positives of his legacy, like his sunny demeanor, all criticism quickly evaporated into slobbery admiration over the spectacle. As scholars Carolyn Kitch and Janice Hume write, what began as coverage of the ceremony sprung from political public relations became, over a week of journalism, seemingly a read on the pulse of America. A portrait of the character of the country's common folk and an assessment of their place in history. By Kitch and Hume's analysis, Reagan's own weaponization of nostalgia for a better time in the 1980s evolved into full-blown nostalgia for Reagan's presidency, effectively creating a second layer of amnesia in Americans' public memory.
It's like what you and Claudia say. They're blind to it.
Obituaries falsely revered him as the most popular president ever to leave office, who fostered Cold War might. And this doesn't reflect reality. Journalist Will Bunch notes that Reagan averaged 53% approval ratings in the Gallup poll, which made him pretty mid. And his presidency was riddled with controversies, like the Iran-Contra scandal. You just look that up. You just type into Google, Iran-Contra, and just read about it. And then let me know if you think it's good. Let me know if you think that Iran-Contra was good.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
And all that spin had political consequences. At the time, George W. Bush's administration was pleased that the tributes eclipsed negative coverage of the Iraq War, while his advisors speculated that Reagan's death would give Bush, who many saw as his tailor-made successor, a bump in the polls. I almost just made a cocaine joke about George Bush, but then I didn't, but I almost did. As Bunch writes, a generation of Reagan-era ideologues stepped into America's memory hole and reintroduced him as someone different. He was no longer an ex-actor turned great communicator following a script, but rather a political thinker and a man of God with an extraordinary character. If you ever try to step into my memory hole without permission, I'll take you out. This image rehabilitation continues to make invoking Reagan a winning strategy for Republican politicians, despite the diligent work of many YouTubers who want nothing more, I don't know, than just to remind you that a lot of the bad stuff traces back to Reagan. It doesn't mean that we're not all fervent young Republicans. It just means that if you look at some of the bad stuff now and you trace it back and you look up, you're like, oh, hello, Mr. Reagan. And he's just standing there and his pants are off. You know, that's why politics can be tough. This urge not to speak ill of even the most powerful dead people, especially by journalists who would happily criticize them in life, speaks to our general culture of compulsory sympathy for the deceased. In this way, how we discuss the dead says more about us than it does about them. Adam Smith observed this in the mid-18th century, around the time the transformation of secularization and individualization was starting to solidify. He argued, as Barrage summarizes, that a significant component of our morality is determined by the fact that the dead function as a mirror of our own mortality. Empathy for the dead is at the root of our compulsion to honor them. That is to say, we imagine we were lying in that mahogany coffin instead and worry how we would be talked about.
I don't know what to tell you, bud. We're just shooting funerals and showing the ones where the bodies fly out.
Sigmund Freud would concur, writing, "Consideration for the dead, who, after all, no longer need it, is more important to us than the truth, and certainly for most of us than consideration for the living." In this way, treating Reagan well in his death carried greater moral urgency than highlighting the people his policies had hurt. The countless black folks imprisoned for petty drug charges and war on drugs.
And by next year, our spending for drug law enforcement will have more than tripled from its 1981 levels.
Or the countless AIDS patients who suffered as Reagan's refusal to take action on, much less talk about the disease, left treatment chronically underfunded. I'm telling you, like anything, just pick a thing, and then trace it back, and you'll see Reagan. No, more importantly, we owed Reagan a decent memorial. We're good people after all. And as Barrage writes, remembrance of the dead has metamorphosed into an important form of morality. Here, it's worth thinking about another change in how we treat death, which occurred during the 20th century. Now, death was, as we mentioned, once inescapable. As late as the Victorian age, death was memorialized through lengthy mourning rituals and elaborate bedside death ceremonies. Mourning was just a natural part of living. But especially after the First World War, the West underwent a retreat from death, whereafter mourning became shorter, more private, and more taboo. As life expectancy soared, death became increasingly absent from most people's daily existence. The process helped along with the rise of institutionalizing the elderly and the creation of the funeral industry, which sanitized and removed the trouble of dealing with the dying and the dead. Death vanished from mainstream life so quickly that some argued death and sex had flipped since the Victorian age. Death replacing sex as the ultimate taboo, and sex replacing death as a constant. Also, it's just weird, like death and sex is two sort of things. I don't like that.
Death by sex. Yeah, sex.
While theorists have argued that the death taboo has begun to fade due to our constant bombardment of images of death in the media, these images are typically more about titillation and sensationalism rather than healthy reckonings with mortality. Now, philosopher Jean Baudrillard argued that death's retreat from daily life and the sequestering of the dead from the realm of the living robbed death of its pre-modern symbolism. Basically, back when people were closer to death and could mourn publicly and talk about it, death was seen less as an end and rather a point on a continuum of existence. Our fear of it was, according to Baudrillard, soluble. As death retreated from mainstream life, Baudrillard argued what cannot be symbolically exchanged becomes that which haunts us. I got a death story for everyone. I think it was like at my dad's funeral. We had this reception afterwards. He was, drinking, snacks, things of that nature. And his buddy, he'll never watch this, John Kelly, takes me aside. He has this Boston accent. And he was like, let me tell you something. I was like, oh boy. And he was like, a lot of guys in our business, they'd go out of town, their wife wasn't around, and they would, And he was like, but your dad? Never once. And I was just like, cool. Did you tell me that because you think that I thought he was? I don't know. Shouts to John Kelly. As a result, death becomes something everyone is afraid of, but has limited experience and limited ways to talk about it. At the same time, our life expectancy has just about doubled since 1800. We all have the potential to live longer than ever. As a result, death feels like it's robbing us of time we were promised. Even at 60 or 70, which would have been considered something of a mortal marathon just a few generations ago. Which is why it felt especially bad when Kissinger was rubbing shoulders at dinner parties with the elite and acting as a celebrity diplomat right up to the 100-year mark. Now, living to 100 alone, minus all the speaking gigs at Harvard perks, is privileged treatment by the fates in and of itself. The media is very obsessed with the idea of living to 100. There's all these articles about it. Now, of course, most of us, and I'm sorry for the spoiler alert here, won't make it to 100. And also, most of us aren't war criminals.
I said we don't need permissions of the family. We're allowed to show him nude because they ain't got no soul.
Which makes Kissinger's comparative luck feel especially unfair and even immoral. In an age when we're all anxious about death and unable to talk about that anxiety, and where we mostly experience death in the abstract, seeing someone as friggin' evil as Kissinger seemingly get away with it by continuing to live feels bad.
You can't keep getting away with it!
dead?
What we're really saying is if God is real, he would have already killed Kissinger. And one way to process that bad feeling is by posting about him on every available platform. Like, honestly, Twitter, or X, has gotten really bad since that guy took it over. But it was a really nice evening when Kissinger died. It felt like old Twitter. Everyone just getting off their jokes, saying funny stuff. It was really beautiful. As we saw with Reagan, obituaries and media coverage of the dead are foundational to society's collective memory, with major ideological implications. As Hume puts it, societies too have the capacity to remember and forget, and this situational relevance plays a role in determining what citizens believe collectively about their history. Collective memory was once mostly influenced by the gatekeepers of the mass media. In a pre-social media age, when everyone still mostly watched the same few news networks and read the same handful of papers, the glowing treatment of a post-mortem Ronald Reagan went mostly uncontested, allowing it to manufacture a sense of collective memory that eclipsed reality. But today, the production of collective memory has changed. According to scholar Andrew Hoskins, the archive is no longer only collected and organized and managed and walled and kept by an array of institutional memory keepers. It is also diffused through a new memory ecology. The digitally fostered values of openness have driven a culture of unbridled commentary that reveals that there is no mainstream. With access to a wider assortment of information and viewpoints than ever, we're less likely to passively accept the mainstream media's polite narrative. And indeed, some media sources seem to have correctly intuited this and then just swung the whole other way. In this climate, Kissinger seems to reflect a moral fissure point. One where, if you've done so many unspeakable things, we're willing to put aside our usual decorum. Where we refuse to see our own mortality reflected in the death of someone who, as a quick Google search can confirm, was truly just a fucking monster. This all makes it way harder to pull off the sort of legacy of a fallen statesman scenario we got when Reagan biffed it. And no matter how terrifying and taboo death remains for us, we're fine not treating Kissinger's with any sort of sacred reverence because he treated so many lives with hollow disregard. But maybe what matters most is that Kissinger's demise led to this glorious tweet. Shout out Liza Minnelli, you're never gonna die. So does the reaction to Kissinger's death represent a paradigm shift in how we evaluate the legacy of public figures? Or was it just an excuse to collectively rage at a pretty easy mark? Will the next bad dude's death be met with parades and glowing speeches? Or are we in a new era where whitewashing an ugly legacy is impossible? Let us know what you think in the comments. And thank you as always for being here, for clicking, for liking, subscribing. It really means a lot to us. And on that note, let me tell you, this was our last video of 2023. We're going to take a couple of weeks off. I hope that's okay. We need to get some rest. It's been a long year. But thanks again for just being with us for another year. Because I'll be honest with you, in digital media, just managing to exist is hard and it means a lot. I think every year we go into it with a little bit of worry. So just know that you have all helped keep us afloat. It means a lot to us. And we really appreciate you hanging out as we try new stuff and we change what we do a little bit. It's just the best. We got a lot of great stuff coming in 2024. We're going to start doing some longer videos. That's pretty exciting, right? We're going to do more streaming. That's pretty cool as well. We're going to roll out some new Patreon features. Very fun. And then maybe hypothetically a second feed where we talk more about movies, but who knows? Either way, we just hope that you'll be there with us in 2024. We love the hell out of you, and we'll see you then. Trace it back, and you'll find yourself there with him, sitting on Reagan's lap saying, "You're not Santa, you're the opposite, because you don't give gifts. You take, and you take, and you take." Although, according to some, Nancy might have advantages over Mrs. Claus, but I've said. This video is brought to you by Ground News. So Shane Gillis recently hosted SNL.
If you don't know who I am, please don't Google that. It's fine. Don't even worry about it.
And this was surprising to some, as in 2019, Gillis had been cast on SNL and then was fired within the week when a video emerged of him using anti-Asian and homophobic slurs on his podcast. Some people hate him for his past behavior, like his tendency to chat with Nazis. Meanwhile, others, like the New York Times, praised his recent special. While Shane Gillis' SNL monologue was fairly tame.
You don't think that's funny to bring my dad here to make fun of him for being a girls' high school basketball coach? All right. I thought it was great. Never mind.
The two opposing camps took to Twitter, or X, after the show to express either their outrage or defense of Gillis, who again had the most cantaloupe of performances. Now, people's reactions felt weirdly polarized for someone who told jokes about dancing with his mom in the car to Shania Twain.
I thought she was cool. I would listen to her music. I'd be like, bam, bam, ba-dam, bam, bam, bam. Let's go, girls.
But these days, polarized reactions to comedy have become the norm. Comedy has historically been used to bring people together, but lately it's turned into a culture war, and it seems like both sides are losing. It feels like comedy is in crisis and no one can agree on what's funny anymore. Now, some will say the Gen Zers who are quick to cancel someone for an offensive joke, that they're the ones killing comedy. Now, others insist that subversive humor, like jokes that poke fun at marginalized groups, is not and has never been funny. Okay, so what's going on here? Are Americans too sensitive? Have young people lost their sense of humor? And why does it feel like no one can take a joke these days?
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Okay, so as we're talking about in this video, our ability to understand humor has to do with our ability to understand the world, and understanding world events is getting really tough these days. And that's why I've been using Ground News. Now, Ground News is a website and an app created to give readers a transparent way to read the news. With access to over 50,000 news sources across the political spectrum, it allows you to compare headlines, see who owns the source, and where the bias leans per article, giving you the complete overview of the story. Today, I was interested in reading about the House bill that could ban TikTok. It's something I care about as both someone who consumes a lot of comedy and content on TikTok and someone that just has a vested interest in digital media. Ground News is showing me it's been covered by 389 sources. And out of those news sources, it's showing me that 28% lean left and 23% lean right, which in this case means that the bias distribution is pretty even. And as I scroll down, I can see every article about this topic, and there's tags next to them, which show me the political bias, the reliability, and ownership of the source. Best of all, you can just compare the headlines, which give you a sense about how bias might influence the framing. One of my favorite features of Ground News is the blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum. When I clicked that, one of the things I got was a story that's underreported on the left is that Taco Bell is closing most of their Oakland dining rooms due to safety concerns, and this feature is fully unlocked with a Vantage plan. Now, I've been using Ground News to help me stay informed on diverse perspectives. What they're doing is crucial because it empowers individuals to make informed decisions by providing comprehensive coverage and facilitating comparison between different viewpoints. So check out the link in the description or go to ground.news/wisecrack and subscribe to get yourself 40% off unlimited access through the Vantage plan, which works out to about $5 a month. When you subscribe, you're not only supporting us, you're also supporting an independent platform trying to make the news more transparent. Now, let's get back to the show. Well, to answer this question, let's first discuss the social function of comedy. Now, you might be asking, isn't comedy just supposed to be, funny?
She told me when it happened, she tried to manually turn it down on the speaker, but because I was hitting up, it just looked like I was bullying her with porn.
And of course it is. If comedy isn't landing, then you're just being preachy.
I am incorrectly female. I'm incorrect. And that is a punishable offense.
Or maybe being a dick.
Don't not give me an answer, okay? It's not very professional.
But just like water is supposed to be wet, it's wet for a reason. And we're interested in talking about precisely why comedy works. And if you want to talk about if that metaphor about water worked, let me know in the comments and we can workshop it. Molière, a 17th century playwright, believed the purpose of comedy, specifically comedic satire, is to correct men's vices. Molière said that to correct men by amusing them, I believe that in my occupation I could do nothing better than attack the vices of my age by making them ridiculous. Molière did this with his play Tartuffe, which was banned for making fun of the Catholic Church. Yeah, it's not a new thing that the Catholic Church struggles to take a joke.
As a wise pastor said Sunday long, parties are towers of Babylon, because the guests all babble on.
Molière believed that audiences signal their understanding or acknowledgement of the truth of a joke with laughter. Take Tina Fey's impression of Sarah Palin.
Well, there were some funny moments. For instance, I had 15 to 20 false alarms where I thought I saw Osama bin Laden driving a taxi.
It killed because something about it resonated as true. Namely, Sarah Palin appeared to have no idea what she was doing. According to Molière, comedy in the form of satire is more powerful than criticism because because it exposes vices to public laughter.
You want to make some money here? Then read the script with a mic.
You know, like how Pennywise loses its power when kids start giggling at him. A scholar, Avner Ziv, writes that modern sophisticated satire does a lot of heavy lifting, from breaking taboos to holding those in power to account. Ziv says comedy and satire possess a common denominator in that both try to change or reform society by means of humor. The two forms together constitute the best illustration there is of the social function of humor. For example,
we do have real cars on my street. I'm not sure what a fake car would be. Exactly.
Or consider Stephen Colbert's appearance at a congressional hearing, where he poked fun of politicians by veering farther to the right than anyone else in the room.
I don't want a tomato picked by a Mexican. I want it picked by an American, then sliced by a Guatemalan, and served by a Venezuelan in a spa where a Chilean gives me a Brazilian.
Colbert was asked to leave the hearing because he was making people feel like fools. Now, activist and comedian Josie Long would argue that was a sign he was doing his job. Long says the role of satirical humor is to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. But beyond satire, comedy more generally has an even broader social function. Cognitive neuroscientist Scott Weems says, "My first thought when I think about humor is it's a great way for us to have evolved so we don't have to hit each other with sticks. And we all use humor to de-escalate tense situations."
The great John only meant to cut my meat for me.
Your meat!
Swords, not words!
Is bloody tough.
Like, you're in the middle of an argument with your partner and it's not going well, but then you figure out how to make a really good fart joke and everyone smiles and laughs and you're in love again, and it's great. More than that, humor is used as a form of psychological processing that helps us cope with the darker, more confusing parts of life. Otherwise known as gallows humor, dark jokes help ease tension, build morale, and make us feel more connected to people who are also suffering. I learned this as a kid because at funerals, my dad would often make jokes, and at first I was like, is my dad a psychopath? But it's actually very helpful. So, if you have any good funeral jokes, share them, because we're all gonna need them, because everyone dies. And this is why we laugh in response to tragic events that shouldn't be funny at all, like how New Yorkers joke about September 11th way more than anyone else.
But you know what ranked least in satisfaction? 9/11 Airlines. What a terrible name for an airline. It reminds me of that tragedy.
So New Yorkers, give us your best jokes in the comments, but don't if you're not from New York, and we can tell. On a more fundamental level, comedy is how we communicate the truth of our personal experiences. Comedian and political commentator John Fugelsang explains, humor validates shared experiences, gets us to think more flexibly, and reframe situations in this shared experience we call life. For example, shows like Insecure and Rami give audiences insight to modern Black and Muslim experiences, using comedy to expand people's perspectives and thus their empathy. So, generally speaking, humor functions as a social lubricant that connects us. It helps us cope with this wild world we live in, speak truth to power, and gives us a voice and audience, so long as we're entertaining. Okay, so now that we sort of understand what a joke can do, let's explore why and when jokes stop being funny. Most obviously, and per Molière, fools do not wish to be ridiculed. When a person is the butt of a joke or feels like their morality has been questioned, they close up and accuse comics of no longer being funny. Or in the case of Donald Trump, they tweet out their live review of Jimmy Kimmel's Oscar monologue. Alternatively, someone might be offended by a joke because it denigrates a certain group of people, more in the spirit of cruelty than truth. Like when people make bald jokes and you think you're being funny, but I don't think it's very funny, and if I'm not laughing, I don't think your bald joke is good. For example, racist jokes often reflect and normalize racist attitudes, making their punchlines for some feel like an actual threat. Now, to those of you who might say, yeah, but comedians are supposed to push boundaries and be offensive, which is fair, let's listen to the king of dark comedy, Anthony Jeselnik.
Well, this is a quote attributed to Andy Warhol that I love. It's just, art is getting away with it. If you put out a special and everyone's pissed, like, you didn't get away with it. You need to make everyone laugh that they're like, yeah, you talked about some fucked up stuff, but we're all happy. That's art. Otherwise, you're just a troll.
Okay, so maybe instead of blaming an audience for not laughing, comedians should, workshop their jokes until they're actually funny. But today, it seems like everyone is offended all the time, right? Millennials, well, we're tired of jokes about avocado toast. The boomers are upset over okay boomer memes when they can pull them up on the phone. And Gen Z is offended by a lot of things. So have we just sort of lost our collective sense of humor? The short answer is yes and no. But to understand why, we got to take a look at how the comedy landscape has changed in recent years. As we know, comedy thrives when it's hitting on something that we believe to be true, whether about people in power or the smell of big stinky farts. Now, this makes it feel subversive and countercultural and edgy, which is good. I like that. And these qualities traditionally made comedy a tool that was primarily used by the more progressive side of the political spectrum, which we see by late-night talk show hosts. Though, as we mentioned in the past, just because comedy feels subversive or edgy to someone doesn't necessarily mean it's actually questioning systems of power. So check out our past videos critiquing late-night comedy for more on that. But lately, we've seen a rise in right-wing comedy, which we also have a video about, which, given what we know about comedy, seems like a reasonable thing to happen when we're under a Democratic president. And it's no coincidence that right now Shane Gillis has one of the most popular Patreons on the planet. Much more popular than ours, but if you want to change that, there's a link in the description. As we discussed in a previous video, right-leaning comedy is all over YouTube, and much like Colbert purposely pushing buttons during the Bush era, these comedians are not afraid to, and are even eager to, offend. It just looks different today, right? There's a lot more slurs or dicey jokes about gender identity to push back against a liberal-leaning political sensibility that hates free speech.
Oh yeah, because it's been long overdue a challenge. The trans community. Oh, they've had their guard down for too long, if you ask me.
But comedy is back as soon as Elon took over X. It's so funny on that website now. It's so funny. And yet, we still disagree on what's funny. And this might be because some comedy is always reflecting something about reality.
When he became leader of Germany, Adolf Hitler was a funny-looking character with silly hair, a bit like Boris Johnson.
So when we disagree on the nature of social and political reality, we're gonna find different things funny. In other words, one man's Rathaniel is another man's, is it Bert Kreischer? I don't know how to say his name right, and I'm not gonna learn. But put a shirt on, Bert. Some of this